I just want to say something about the article I wrote about the Russian deserters, because I really think that's one of the things that makes being a historian so interesting. That you can find one document, which I found one document on the Russian deserters, and you can use it as a building block for something quite interesting and which sheds a light on real life in a way that lots and lots of documents which come from above don't have. The Russian deserters were deserters from the Tsar's army. And they deserted for all sorts of reasons, and you can imagine what they were: the harshness of the environment, the hopelessness of their situation because of the length of conscription, the danger, the actual fighting, the terrible losses on the battlefield, and so on and so on. So we have this case of as the Russian armies advanced towards Iran, there was a greater mingling. And the deserters, we have this group of deserters who go to Iran and volunteer to serve under Abbas Mirza at the beginning of the 19th century. And there's not a huge number, but a continuous stream of men who desert from the Russian army and take refuge in Tabriz under the existing Iranian structures there. And we know something, because there's always this tendency to say, well, Iran is seeking knowledge from Europe, and they send students and so on. So the exchange of information and the exchange of experience is at the top. People sent by the Shah to study, princes and so on. But I was interested in what was going on below the surface, if you like. As these deserters arrived, the Russian deserters arrived from the Russian army and settled in Tabriz, and they formed a regiment of their own. So you have in Tabriz a regiment of Russian deserters. And there's information about how they integrated into local society and how they exchanged their existing military technology. So again, you think of the exchange of military technology at the top, but this is going on below. So the deserters, for example, drilled the troops, taught them how to drill, taught them what modern warfare was like. And the Russian deserters also married local women and settled there. And eventually they were offered the choice of repatriation or settling permanently in Iran, and some of them went on both courses. But it's quite interesting to see that how much exchange is going on at subaltern levels. It doesn't all have to wait to come from the Shah and the British universities or the French universities. It's going on at these different levels. And there are funny stories about the Russian deserters going to the mosque. And of course, there's a lot in popular Islam which is familiar to popular Christianity anyway. The stories from the Gospels, for example, the same stories. And so the Russian deserters would go and they would pray according to their own understanding, and they would cross themselves in the mosque and this kind of thing. And it was perfectly acceptable. Nobody was worried by it. And it gives you a view of subaltern life as not in the least bit fanatical. There's this tendency to think that whenever ordinary or we come to the tribes, when they enter into political activity, it must be kind of fanatical. But we see a different kind of subaltern life where change is accepted. They are Christians, we are Muslims, it's all fine. There's no need for this to be much of an issue. And they seem to have got on very well there. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think, being a historian, you come across a document or two and it suddenly sheds torchlight on something that was completely dark before that. And of course, you have to use, to some extent, your imagination as well to make sense of this. But it just opens up a different world. So you're not any longer dealing with what the Shah thought or what his ministers thought or what the British ambassador thought. But these are everyday people living their lives in the way they think is best. And it's not as you might expect. easygoing. These people were welcomed. They were integrated easily. There was no problem about marrying local women. So it's a way of looking at that kind of thing. You just discover that, and you discover that you can actually say something about what life was like for people below the normal attention of the archives. Apparently, the main document on the Russian deserters was written by someone who had spoken to them years earlier. So he wrote the document quite late in life, remembering what the conversation had been like and what they'd said. So it really isn't much in terms of concrete information. Right. But I think it's interesting just in terms of a kind of flicker of light about what at the beginning of the 19th century life must have been like. This idea of transitions is very interesting. We discussed the transition from dynasty to dynasty. Yes. But this transition from agriculture to industry is also very interesting and quite traumatic. And again, in Abadan, you have old hierarchies reasserting themselves. So you have this kind of, you have different categories of workers. So you have workers in the oil refinery who have a certain amount of collective power and are employed by the company. So they are workers. But you also have, and they're largely Persian speaking, but you also have recruits from people among Arab-speaking Arabs, and they are recruited by the Khans themselves, who are employed by the company as contractors. As contractors. So you have this again. The company is also aware of these differences, because in 1946, at the height of the Tudor power among the unions in the oil company regions, you have under British auspices, there is a conflict. There's an attempt by the Tudor to launch a strike, and it's sabotaged, or at least there's an attempt to undermine it and to break it by employing Arabs. So you can see that even the oil company is now alive to the complexity of social arrangements and how they can be exploited. I think a lot of the literature sees the tribes in terms of high politics. And because there are so many tribal dynasties, this tends to be the way people have approached this question. My interest really grew out of my PhD thesis, which was about the army. So it's a kind of first I deal with the army and then the army's opponents. But I was interested really in the tribes from the point of view of social history again.
So history from below.
History from below. But also history from below in terms of the ordinary conscript and how the tribes in particular reacted to the demand for conscripts, because it was more problematic for the tribes than for the settled communities, because the tribes needed manpower at certain times of the year in a way that if you're living in a town, you don't. And one of the things the army found, which I thought was quite amusing, is that there would always be mass desertions at harvest time. And then, so young men would just go in order to help with the harvest in the rural areas, and then they'd come back. And eventually the army authorities had to take this into account, you know, that this is how things are, and we can't, and of course, it was a very bad idea to try and change them, because what you found in the 1930s is there's a great shortage of foodstuffs that the tribes usually produce, which they just stopped producing. So I think the lesson the Islamic Republic learned was to be more pragmatic about this kind of thing. Insofar as the nomadic way of life, albeit now with 4x4s, but insofar as it's ecologically and agriculturally useful, it can stay. Whereas for Reza Shah, the suppression of the tribes became a kind of, not exactly propaganda exercise, but it was a symbol of state power.
Right. It was
so in a way, the consequences, you know, you would have to live with them, but Reza Shah wanted everyone to understand that he was now in charge. And once you accepted that, all sorts of things became possible. But you had to bend the knee first.
So you have mainly spent most of your adult life working, writing, researching as a historian, mainly as a historian of Iran and Middle East, but you are even more engaged. It's not just researching and publications. You edit a book series. You speak. In the recent few months, I have seen several of your public engagements. So, of course, we all wonder, what is your assessment of Iranian studies as a sort of scholarly community? More specifically, where do you think it is going? What are some of the positive trends? Are works by a scholar of Iranian history, but generally speaking, Iran, that gives you hope that the field is going toward a direction that you would like to see? What are the shortcomings? You don't need to respond to me specifically, but generally speaking, what is your overall assessment of where the field is going, or what is the state of the sort of scholarly works on Iran? And if you want to call, since you have done a number of editing volumes that include Iran and the Middle East.
I find it difficult to think about the field in general because it is so diverse, and I can see that that it's intellectually diverse. I think we have this rather strange situation where we have a field, a community, which is 90% drawn from people with Iranian heritage, which I think is not always a very good, a very healthy situation. But on the other hand, the range and depth of the work that people are doing is very encouraging. So what I would like to see, I think, is, and again, perhaps this is just a slightly different way of saying what I said before. What I would like to see is some opening up in terms of abilities to go to Iran, to do archival research in Iran, to think about collaborative projects. And that might seem a little bit unrealistic at the moment, but it's my hope for the future. Because I do think this situation where you have a very now numerically quite large field, most of whom, Iranian or not Iranian, can't go to the country concerned. This cannot be a good way of conducting intellectual work in the long run. So I think there's that, but I also, on the other hand, I think that there is some really first-class work being done in the field that I look at, which is social history and modern history, which is very sophisticated and very subtle and not beholden to a political project of either supporting the Islamic Republic or opposing it actively. So I think people have managed to preserve some scholarly approaches in very difficult circumstances. So I suppose those are the two things. I would like to see the situation different in terms of relations between Iran and other countries, so that we could continue our work in peace. On the other hand, I feel quite encouraged by the breadth of some of the work that's being done by young people. I mean, I can think of several really first-class works on social history just in the last year or so. And the work that I do with Edinburgh University Press on editing the series also shows me that there is still, despite the situation, there is still a great deal of groundbreaking work being done, and I think that's encouraging. But the field itself, in a way, too big. You can only think about your little corner of it and whether your little corner is thriving or not. And I feel that my little corner of modern social history is doing pretty good, you know, in terms of the work that's being done, and I hope that people will look at my work and think that this is, you know, the beginning of something and not the end of something. That younger people will look at what I've done and think, that they can contribute to developing these themes and elaborating them, and we can build something, more sophisticated for the future. But it does. These hopes do boil down to practical matters of posts and employment and things like this. And in the UK, it will be very difficult to employ someone who was a specialist in Iran at the moment, for various reasons, not all of them sinister, but they would just think that this is a dead end, quite honestly. It sounds rather brutal, but an appointments committee will look at this and say, well, what about PhD students? What about research in Iran? What about grants? How are you going to get grants if you can't go to the archives? So there are some really mundane issues as well, but they have a big impact. It's like throwing a pebble into the sea. There are all sorts of ramifications because the situation in this country is so bad in terms of public services anyway. We have a cost of living crisis. They're constantly squeezing the universities. There is no money. So it's also to do with the general situation in this country. That we are not funding Middle Eastern studies. It sounds crazy when you think about the situation. We have the Iraq War, but we don't know anything about Iraq because we have so few specialists. We have all sorts of interventions now in the Middle East without any sort of expertise. Whole countries, you'd search to find someone. There are a few people lingering in employment in the UK universities working on Iran, but fewer and fewer.
So there is hope.
There's always hope.
There is hope. Yes.
Sometimes it's...
Do you have opportunities to read works of historians who live and write in Iran? Any comments you may have about works that are produced in Iran?
Well, I mentioned this website, Mardam Name, which they have a journal, and I think they very much influenced by subaltern studies and history from below. And the journal produces very interesting articles, I think. There's one, you can go to their website and they're there, and articles on domestic service in Iran, for example, articles on theft. There's an article on asylums in Iran, clearly with Foucault centre stage. So I think that they're a good example of really promising work that's being done at the moment, and that's what I should say is some light at the end of the tunnel, because it is this kind of work is continuing. It just becomes more difficult.